Great. Well, thank you very much indeed, Joe. And just while Chris is getting the presentation up, I think I'll stand up. And I've been told that I have to hold a microphone. Is that all right, sound-wise, just so our colleagues online can hear? I'm Jonathan Mitchell. I've had the privilege to work with Chris to write this book, and I'm just going to. The two of us are going to try and do two things in about 25 minutes. One is to summarise 4 years' work and quite a lot of research by ourselves and others, try and summarise that in 20 minutes. But more than that, we're going to try and summarise the evolution of our thinking, because this took quite a long time. And what we think now is very different from what we thought at the beginning. We thought it'd be interesting just to give you an insight to that and might help stimulate the debate. In terms of the structure of our presentation, I'm going to do 3 nerdy slides, really just to get you on the page in terms of conceptually what we did and why we did it. And then we've picked our 5 key findings, and we're going to present those in fairly broad terms to try and provoke a debate. So, moving swiftly on, how bad is the development sector at recognising success? I mean, one of the most dramatic features of developments in the South over the last 30 years is this very significant reduction in poverty. People have been announcing the end of the third world for some time now. Even if that's premature, I do find it staggering that 3/4 of the population of the South, their living standards are very dramatically catching up with those enjoyed in the North. And I think this has got dramatic impacts on power relations, international institutions and others. Even if we just look at rural poverty, and even if we look at the absolute numbers of people, you can see the lines on the graph dipping down. And so we're now in a situation where there's only about 1 billion people, predominantly in rural areas in the South, who are living in absolute poverty. And the striking thing, if you look at the map, is that they're living in 2 areas. One is South Asia, and the other is Sub-Saharan Africa. And if you look at the lines there, it's not only where poor people are living, but it's where poverty is not reducing. So it's really our project, if we move on to the next slide, our project was very much focused on those areas, looking at rural poor in areas of long-standing poverty, to see whether we could help people engage more productively and successfully with global economic processes. We used a value chain development approach and a deliberate effort to integrate poverty, environment and gender into this tool that's traditionally been a business studies tool. If you look at the places and the commodities that we're working on for the empirical part of this book, really quite a range. We looked at staple crops in Africa, cassava in Tanzania and fonio in Mali. We looked at fisheries, octopus in Senegal and catfish in Vietnam, horticulture, lemons in the Philippines, and non-timber forest products in South Asia, in India and Nepal. It's incense sticks and bay leaves. In addition to those studies, we also did a systematic review of the literature on value chain upgrading, so that we were able to draw on a whole load of evidence of coffee and a whole lot of other commodities and other geographical areas. And all those are brought together in the book to provide the empirical basis. Now, if we move on to the next slide, this is the last nerdy slide. And for those of you that might need a brief reminder, this is a value chain, or it's a representation of a value chain. That's the circles with the line up it. And really what it's showing is just that the commodities we consume have been through a range of processes. They're produced, they're processed, they're sometimes exported where the source country is elsewhere. They're imported into the country of consumption and used. And the round bits are the nodes. That's where production, for instance, is happening, or processing. And the line is just a link between them. Now, the idea of upgrading is a very simple one. It's really just how can people benefit, how can they improve their position within a value chain and benefit more from that. And there are lots of different ways that you can do it. And they're represented by the blue blobs. For instance, with functional upgrading, that's just taking on new activities. So it could be a farmer deciding, sod this, I'm going to become a processor, and moving up the value chain, getting more reward for that. Can be working more efficiently, it's process upgrading. Producing better products that you can sell for more, product upgrading. And interchain upgrading is where you take the skills that you've learnt from doing one thing, from making widgets, for instance, and apply those skills to a completely different value chain. For instance, making toothbrushes, that's another form of upgrading. Now, so far it's all very business school. This could be a niche, high-tech outfit in Singapore. Development has grabbed the value chain idea and turned it into something that's useful to itself. And in that, it's added a couple of other upgrading strategies. One is horizontal upgrading, and all that means is that within a node, it's people cooperating. Typically, a low-income farmer cannot access international export markets by him or herself. So typically, the people will work together in various different legal structures that Chris is going to talk about a bit, in order to have the scale to get into viable markets. So that's the horizontal cooperation. And then the vertical upgrading, really significant again from development perspective. And this is where, for instance, supermarkets, rather than just having spot transactions with their suppliers, have longer term transactions and start developing an interest and supporting their suppliers. Now, both those types of upgrading are extremely important from a development point of view. Right, so that's the lesson over, and we're going to give you 5 key findings that we've talked about in the book. First one is, does it work? And really simple question. Can you, through value chain upgrading, can you improve the incomes of poor people in rural areas in the south? Now, our not entirely helpful answer is yes, you can. And in most of our Asian studies, we did. We did a lot of monitoring before, during, and after the intervention. And we did improve incomes, but not by very much. We got very excited about the Nepal bay leaf case study because we increased the incomes of households producing bay leaves, collecting and processing them, by $87 a year per household. And that was our big success story. So we're not talking about taking people permanently and dramatically out of poverty. We're talking about incremental improvements to their living standards. It's also true that people in rural areas are very inconvenient livelihood structures compared, I think, with us. We tend to work for an organisation like The Guardian, and we get paid, and we might do 1 or 2 other things, but that's our main source of income. In almost all our studies, households had half a dozen sources of livelihood. So we didn't just look at the improvement in their livelihoods from the chain that we were helping them with. We had to check what was happening elsewhere in the household economy to make sure that wasn't going down as the livelihood that we're looking at was going up. Really hard to be analytical and to find a proper control area. You know, if you're trying to say, well, this project has had this effect on this group of people, the first thing you need to do is to demonstrate that is to have a control, so people that the project is not intervening with. Really difficult, both philosophically, because then in order to have a control group, then you or the government or the project sponsor has to decide not to help a group of people who are similar in every way apart from the fact they're not being helped. So it's quite an interesting moral conundrum there. But there's also, as we do more of this work, quite often you'll identify beneficiaries, a couple of hundred people living up a hill, who'll be collecting bay leaves. Quite often the project will have an impact elsewhere. There'll be spillover effects, people outside the project area, in which case you contaminate. If you've chosen a group outside that area as a control, you can contaminate that because of these spillover effects. So it's actually quite difficult to answer the most simple question about did it work and did it improve people's livelihoods. There's also the time dimension. A couple of our 7 studies were looking at organic cultivation, and everyone that's involved with that knows that it takes 4 or 5 years to start making a return. But because we work in development and we have an 18-month or at very most a 24-month time horizon, it's very difficult to be able to answer the question, did it work or not, in half the time that it should work, even if everything is going fine. And the final point really on this slide is just how bad the development sector generally is at measuring impact, particularly with market development projects. Thank goodness for the donor committee on enterprise development. About 10 years after these kind of projects really started the market development approach, about 10 years after a lot of money was starting to be spent on this, they've this year produced a framework for analysing the impact of these. So it's a bit late, but it's really good that it's happened. Now, if I hand over to Chris, he's going to talk about the role of government.
Thank you, John. So, thinking about our work on the political economy that surrounds these markets, these value chains, clearly the role of government is important, and clearly it can be enabling or disabling, it can be helpful or unhelpful. And in some cases where governments are trying to be helpful, they can be unhelpful. Some ways in which governments interfere with markets is by setting minimum floor prices. This was the case in Tanzania in the cotton and cashew nut industries, pictures there on the left. And in those cases, it was pretty disastrous. The markets closed temporarily, the buyers ran away, and that was disastrous for both the producers who were trying to sell their products, some cases ended up rotting on the trees, and for the buyers who had nothing to buy at a sustainable price. Thinking about taxation, revenue collection, fees, that kind of thing. Clearly taxation is important. It enables governments to provide services to their populations. But in some developing countries, agricultural commodities are seen as cash cows. It's an easy way to earn money. And in many cases, we've seen that these tax burdens are actually quite significant deductions to the farmer's income. In some cases, government institutions can be somewhat schizophrenic. So thinking in this case about the East African coffee industry and the Tanzanian cotton industry that we're looking at recently, the same organizations are
I don't think it's going to stretch.
the same organizations are both regulating the industry, supervising the industry and the way it works, and they're representing different players across the value chain. Hello? I'll just speak up a bit.
It will help if you hold that. It's to feed through for the online. It's not to.
Sorry.
It's just for the online people to hear.
Okay. Hello?
That's it.
Yeah. Great.
Don't we love technology? Okay.
Thank you. And sometimes government priorities, government programs, government legislation can conflict with each other. One example is in the incense stick project that John mentioned in India, where a government-funded NGO was implementing the project, heavily subsidized by taxpayers' money, while at the same time the producers were lobbying for tax relief. And in fact, that project was not viable without tax relief in the local market. And lastly, clearly we like value chains, we like value chain development, we like enterprise development, but we're not suggesting that it's always the answer for every situation. And looking at the efficiency of some of these programs at transferring money to producers, as John was mentioning, versus, for example, a more traditional social protection approach of simply transferring money directly to people, sometimes there wasn't a great return on investment. So those are some of the lessons looking at political economy. And now John is going to talk about a little bit about what we've learned in terms of the choice of the chain that you're going to work in.
Thanks very much, Chris. And very briefly then, this basic issue about with which chain do you work? Earlier this month, my colleague Peter, sitting at the back, had a public meeting in Parliament, and the subject was, have we got development the wrong way round? And I think that's very, very appropriate for value chain analysis. If what we're trying to do is really reduce poverty at scale, and we're talking about hundreds of millions of people, you know, we're talking about 1 billion people, so we're talking about reducing poverty at scale. It's not a couple of hundred people here and there. Why do we focus on niche products? Why do we start at the producer end? We find some poor people and then try and find something for them to do that might improve their lives, rather than following the logic of value chain analysis, which is to look at the market and see how that's currently engaging with people working in the source countries, and see if you can make a marginal change at the market end that will have a large impact on the source end. I think it's a very strong argument that we are doing, in fact, the thing the wrong way round. We're starting at the wrong end of the value chain. We're looking at niche rather than mainstream chains. And what we're focusing on is trying to change the lives of a few hundred people rather than transform markets more broadly. I think also that the world is changing very fast. It's not just because of the North Atlantic recession, depression. It's also that things are actually moving rather fast in the south now, and partly because of income growth, partly because of urbanisation. Increasingly, we're finding that domestic markets are actually a better proposition. They're less risky. They often have as high returns as international markets for southern producers. And then finally, just in terms of how we go about our work as value chain practitioners, we need a stronger rationale for interventions than here is a group of people who have low incomes. We really need to understand the markets we're working in, and we need to understand what is stopping poor producers participating more viably in chains. As value chain practitioners on permanent contracts, I think we need to be a bit more sensitive to the risks that we sometimes, through our recommendations, impose on low-income southern producers. Even before climate change, rain-fed agriculture in semi-arid parts of Africa had about a 1 in 4 wipeout rate, and that's clearly only going to increase, and we have to think very carefully about the risk and the ways that we can mitigate risk when we're making recommendations about linking people into commercial value chains. And then finally, on the gender issue, how often have we found the project being developed in an almost entirely male-dominated value chain, and some bright spark just before the project goes for funding says, oh, we've forgotten gender, and puts a completely impossible gender target, like 50% of the beneficiaries are going to be women. So in addition to doing something that's already quite complicated, as developing a value chain, you also have to completely change cultural traditions and practices amongst the beneficiary group in 24 months. You can use the fact that value chains are engendered in a progressive sense. You can look for ones where women are already active or could be active with a relatively easy change. But we really do need to get away from the idea that you can take, for instance, maize in sub-Saharan Africa and turn it into a gender-friendly value chain in a short intervention from a foreign donor, because it's not going to work. On that slightly depressing note, I hand back to Chris, who's going to talk about the horizontal cooperation.
Thank you, John. So what we're calling horizontal coordination or cooperation, what normal people refer to as working together, can leverage enormous benefits if, and it's a big if, the leadership of these groups is strong and effective, and if the structures, if the way these groups are set up is appropriate. And for example, by appropriate, we mean using social rather than physical capital in the selection of its members. So using kind of social networks, people who know each other rather than the assets, what people own. Using pre-existing groups and working with them rather than imposing external structures. And trying to avoid kind of easy defaults like tick boxes of having a default number of women, for example, or a default proportion of women in a group, and assuming that that's going to yield results. So if these prerequisites are in place, then we're arguing that joint working can leverage enormous benefits. However, by its very nature, it's an exclusive process. And we're happy to explain why we would argue that that's not necessarily a bad thing, and indeed, often it's a good thing. But it is something you need to bear in mind. Some of the benefits that can come from working together include a leveraging of economies of scale to reduce costs, to share costs, and to increase efficiency of working within these nodes within the value chain. Increasing bargaining power in transactions. And often working in groups is a way of accessing services, be they public services, private services from a firm, or third sector services from a donor or from an NGO, which again leads us back to the idea of exclusion, and if indeed people are being excluded, then what do we do about that? Working together can be a vehicle for leveraging change in gender dynamics. John mentioned planning to change gender dynamics in value chains, but it's not a given. And again, we shouldn't assume because we change the numbers of women in a group that that's necessarily going to lead to real change at, say, the household level or the community level. And similarly, working in groups can be a means for managing natural resources. And there's a whole body of research, Ellen Ostrom famously, and others, around the prerequisites for success in group management of natural resources. So again, that's not a given. Another hugely important factor in the sustainability and success of value chain development is the existence of a business case. And I'm going to give two examples of where, within our program, the business case was weaker. In the first case of Pangasius catfish in the Mekong Delta in Vietnam, the processors who buy the catfish have a core supply model. So they buy most of their catfish from large and medium scale producers, so medium scale being anyone with over half a hectare of pond area up to about a hectare, large scale producers being those with a pond area of over a hectare. And from their own facilities, they produce their own fish because it reduces the risk of not being able to buy enough fish or not being able to buy enough fish of sufficient quality. So that's where their core supply comes from. And these smaller producers are kind of used almost as a top-up. So there are no real incentives for the processors to contract with small producers. There's no real business model for that. And secondly, globally, food standards, environmental standards are rising all the time, and smaller producers are kind of running just to stay still. It's enormously expensive both in terms of money and in terms of technological investment, to achieve even the minimum standards. And also, processors regard the minimum food safety standard as a non-competitive issue, because they don't receive any extra money for complying with these standards, so they're not able to pass on a premium to producers if they meet the minimum standard. So in this case, the business case for inclusion of the smallest, poorest producers is quite weak. Another example was these green fruits are calamansi citrus from the Philippines. In Mindanao, which is a very remote area of the Philippines, an underdeveloped area of the Philippines, we were working with calamansi farmers, and one of their projects was to try to supply the Jollibee fast food company based in Metro Manila. They were actually supported by a CSR fund within the company to try and enable them to sell fresh fruit to them to supply to their fast food customers. It was enormously expensive in terms of technological input to try to get this fruit in a tropical environment from this very remote rural area through road transport, through shipping to Manila in the condition that they required it in. And in fact, the costs were so high that there was no real business case for these guys supplying Jollibee compared to, say, a producer down the road. So again, that was a project that had a particularly weak business case. On a brighter note, Starbucks have been working with producer cooperatives all over the developing world in order to try to buy particular kinds of high quality coffee. And after experimenting with direct purchase from the cooperatives, they settled on an intermediary model through exporters at the country level, which the exporters providing services to the producers and to Starbucks, which reduce risk to both parties. So if you can imagine, if a container of coffee ends up in, say, New York and it's rejected, that's no good to Starbucks, and it's certainly no good to a producer in rural Ethiopia. There's nothing they can do with that. So to reduce risk to both parties, they now work through an intermediary model, which works very well and enables the small-scale producers to be linked to this global market. And finally, the flower seed industry. Its business model integrates small-scale producers because working with hundreds of small-scale outgrowers gives them access to a whole diversity of microclimates that can grow a different variety of flowers that you could never achieve on your own farm, and also clearly outsource the risk of trying to grow flowers on your own farm. So that's a summary of the key points from our research, both the book and other research that ODI is currently doing in value chains. And I'm going to hand back to John, who's going to give us a brief summary of some of the bigger picture conclusions that have come out of this work.
That's great. Thank you very much, Chris. You'll be relieved to hear this is the last slide. So thank you very much for your patience. The room is very full and you've been tremendous. Thank you. We just don't buy the line that markets don't reach poor areas of poor countries. We've done a lot of work in some of the most remote parts of the most conflict affected states, and very often the market is the only institution that is actually functioning in those areas. And we also don't believe that markets cannot benefit poor people. We've produced some evidence that it can do under certain circumstances. We really like value chains, but we just see them as a tool, and we would prefer that they were used properly. This tool is used properly. We'd like people to, when they're starting work on a chain, to really understand the market that they're engaged in. We think it's important that they understand the obstacles to the target group, what's stopping them engage with the chain, to work at scale and to really understand the business logic for why the market should be interested in engaging with poor people, and to monitor the results carefully and honestly. Another conclusion that we think that the world changed very significantly with reference to this subject area about 3 years ago. We think that very broadly that the balance between supply and demand changed. And that's most obvious, for instance, with the food price hike, where we ended a period where there was huge supply, limited demand, and really the market could dictate terms to producers. Clearly that's changed, and it looks like changing on a long-term basis, notwithstanding the recession in the north. But we think in a whole range of other areas as well, that increasingly corporate interests are very, very interested for purely financial reasons, for business reasons, in securing their supply chain. And in this sense, there was a term coined by one of my value chain heroes, Bill Vorley, 2 days ago in that room, just there, where he talks about a convergence between a private sector and a development agenda, that really for the first time the two are now beginning to use either the same words or have the same meaning to their activities. That what was corporate social responsibility is now thoroughly in the mainstream of many corporates. And it's not just food, it's cotton, it's cocoa, it's tea, it's coffee, and it's happening very, very fast. In terms of the impact and sustainability, we do think the market development approaches are very well worth a look. And the final point I'd like to make, on the bottom bullet there, you've got a link that will allow you to download the whole book at no cost at all to yourselves. So we're removing any barrier to entry to joining the debate. Have a look at the book, disagree with us, and ask us questions after the discussant has made her points. But also on an ongoing basis, you know where we are. We'd be delighted to engage with you on this rapidly emerging and developing area. Thanks very much.